Well, it was just about 8 years ago now, back in 2013, that our church, Douglas UCC, established a search and call committee. And their job, the purpose of that group, was to search for a new pastor for this church. And the 5 people that were on that committee back then, Bud Beatty and Bill Klatt and Barb Lucier and Jeff Spangler and Marilyn Fox, they did so much work in preparing for all of the interviews they did for potential candidates for this pastor's position. I know before they interviewed me, they really did their homework on me. And so they Googled my name and they listened to sermons that I had given at other churches in the area over the years. And during the interview, they said they were really impressed by what they heard, but they mentioned that there was one sermon that really concerned them. And it was the one in which I said that rocks were alive. And I know that's a really weird thing to say. But the sermon that I was giving at that church, it was for Palm Sunday. And if you know the Palm Sunday story, Jesus is coming down a mountain on a donkey into Jerusalem. And the people are so excited to see him that they're making so much noise. And so the Pharisees, the religious authorities of Jesus' day, they tell Jesus to keep the people quiet. And Jesus says to them, "If they be silent, these stones will shout." He's pointing to the mountains, that the mountains would shout if the people were quiet. Jesus was saying that the mountain was alive. And I know that's a weird thing for us because we do think of rocks as being inanimate objects. You know, the rest of God's creation, we seem to say that they're filled with God's Spirit, that we say human beings have spirits and souls. We think our animals, you know, our pets, they have spirits and souls, don't they? And many of us even think that our plants have spirits. That's why research says that you should talk to your plants, that it helps them grow. But when we think about rocks, we don't really think about them that way, but think about it. Who made the rocks? Who made the mountains? Did man create the mountains? No, they are part of God's creation, which means that they too are infused with God's DNA, with God's stuff. That is why many people today from various faith traditions, they actually pray and meditate with rocks. They hold rocks or agate stones or crystals in their hand as they pray. And in recent years, we know that stone massages have become really popular, that the stones are said to have healing energy. Now, our indigenous ancestors understood this. They believed that the earth in which we are standing is alive. And they believed that the mountains and the hills are sacred and holy. So today we are celebrating the mountains, and I want to thank Barb Skipper from our Creation Justice team for those wonderful words and that beautiful image now that I have in my mind of those mountains. But you know, in our epistle, our weekly church newsletter this week, I shared a quote from John Muir, the famous environmentalist, the founder of the Sierra Club. He was known as John of the Mountains. And the quote I shared, he said, "I'd rather be in the mountains thinking about God than in a church thinking about mountains." And of course, that's what we're doing this morning. We're in a church thinking about mountains. But there's another quote that I shared from the writer Aldous Huxley, who said, "My father said that a walk in the mountains is as equivalent as worshiping in church." So I think what both John Muir and Huxley were trying to get at was that God's presence and power is felt in the mountains. And I know that firsthand. I shared with you last year, you all gave me the gift of a sabbatical, and I shared how I spent 1 month alone up in the mountains of Idlewild, California, at a place called Spirit Mountain. And I really so strongly felt the Spirit while I was on that mountaintop. And then, of course, some of you came with me back in 2016. I led 20 of you to New Mexico, and we went on this very kind of perilous journey up a mountain on this one winding road. But when we got there, we got to a place called Christ in the Desert Monastery. And there, the chapel had huge floor-to-ceiling windows, not stained glass windows, clear windows, because it looked out at those beautiful red rock formations there in New Mexico. When you sat in that chapel and prayed and meditated, you weren't staring at a cross or stained glass windows. You were staring at those beautiful red rock mountains. And boy, you really felt God's presence and power in those mountains. Now, as we heard in our words of integration and guidance this morning, throughout the Bible, we see that God appears to people in the mountains, whether that be Noah or Elijah or Moses or Jesus. If you've been with us the past few Sundays, we've been talking about how the ancient people believed that God lived up in the sky. So it would make sense that they would think, if I got to the top of a mountain, that's the closest I can get to where God is. So we heard in our first reading from Exodus that famous story of Moses in the burning bush. Moses had to go to the top of the mountain, and there he experiences God's presence and light in the burning bush and hears God's voice. And then we hear something very similar in the New Testament. Jesus also goes up to the mountain, and there again we see the light and we hear the voice of God. So what does that mean for us? I mean, does that mean that if we want to hear God's voice and we want to feel God's presence, do we have to literally go up to a mountaintop? Do we have to go to Idlewild or Colorado or someplace? Well, I've shared with you before that the stories in the Bible are really not meant to be understood at just a literal understanding. We're supposed to read them symbolically or spiritually. And I loved how Barb this morning talked about the mountaintop experience being something metaphorical that happens within us. Because that's what the biblical stories are trying to get us to do. They're trying to get us to ascend, arise from our lower self to our higher self. All of us have a lower self and a higher self. The lower self is concerned about worldly, earthly things, and it kind of dwells in worry and fear. But in prayer and meditation, we can ascend the mountain. We can begin to see things from a higher perspective, from a higher consciousness. It's why Psalm 121 says, I will lift up my eyes to the mountains, from whence comes my help. When we go to prayer and meditation with our earthly concerns and worries, we can lift up our eyes, close our physical eyes, lift up our spiritual eye to the mountain, so that we can begin to see people and situations from a higher place, a higher perspective, to see things the way God sees them. Now, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who was a Christian minister, he famously said, I have been to the mountaintop. So which mountain did he climb? Well, again, he was talking spiritually, metaphorically. He said, God called me to the mountain, and I have been to the mountaintop. I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. During prayer and meditation, Dr. King caught a vision of the promised land, of what our world could look like, a place of equality and peace and oneness. And my friends, you can glimpse that very same thing. In prayer and meditation, you can ascend the mountain. I mean, yes, you can go physically climb a mountain if you want, or, we have here in Saugatuck Mount Baldhead. It's 303 steps that you can climb. And of course, you're going to, when you get to the top, have this incredible view of God's creation. You will feel God's presence there. But in prayer and meditation, we close our eyes and we ascend, we arise, so that we can get a glimpse of a vision of what our life could be, of what our worlds can be. So I invite you to spend time this week, each and every day, ascending the mountain. I'd like to conclude my homily with the words from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 2, verse 3. He said, "Come, my friends, let us go up the mountain where God can teach us to walk more fully in God's path. Come, let us go up to the mountain of God." Namaste.